Teens in movies are just as complicated as they are in real life. A conversation with Columbia's director of adolescent medicine, up next on Science Goes to the Movies. Welcome to Science Goes to the Movies, a look at the stories of science and how they change our culture. I'm Faith Saley, and today we're going to talk about teen movies with Dr. Soren, Director of Adolescent Medicine at Columbia University Medical Center and New York Presbyterian Hospital. Welcome, Karen.
Thank you.
After a wild adventure with the Avengers, Tom Holland's Spider-Man comes home to live with Aunt May and try to readjust to the normal life of a teen with a secret superhero identity.
There's a little gray area in there, and that's where you operate.
Oh.
All right.
That's not a hug. I'm just grabbing the door for you. All right, kid. Good luck out there.
Listen, I know school sucks.
Peter, you still with us?
Yeah.
I know you want to save the world, but you're not ready yet.
You're the Spider-Man.
No, I'm not. This is just a costume. This is
You're on the ceiling.
Stay close to the ground and stay out of trouble.
In this movie, Spider-Man cannot wait to have these huge, exciting, dangerous adventures. In your practice, how many of the adolescents you see have this kind of supersized thirst for adventure?
You know, it's actually a very, very important part of adolescent development, and pretty much most teenagers go through it, generally when they're younger. We sort of look at early adolescents as kids who have this huge fantasy life, who think that they can do anything, want to be. Short kids want to be basketball stars, right? Clumsy girls want to be ballerinas. Anything is possible.
It's
Anyone
so
can be
lovely.
president. And it's one of the most wonderful times, I think, this fantasy time of their lives. And kids want to be superheroes. It's totally realistic in adolescent development.
Is there an age at which you kind of generally see those big dreams bumping into reality?
You know, it's interesting because generally 11 to 14 is what we consider the fantasy time, the early adolescent time. Somewhere around 14 through 16, reality sets in, and sometimes quite harshly. And then a lot of those dreams get dashed when kids understand that they can only do so much, that they are limited by certain things.
When we see teens portrayed in movies and TV shows, they're often incredibly fearless. Do real-life adolescents with these big dreams and goals also have a kind of fearlessness or recklessness?
I think teenagers are quivering masses of anxiety.
Oh.
It's so interesting, but they want to be fearless. They want to be heroes. I think that's a beautiful dream, but in reality, most adolescents sort of tiptoe through life very, very anxious.
Why? Where does that fear come from? Even adolescents with like wonderful supportive families?
Yeah, because they're figuring things out. And when you're figuring things out, when your body's changing, when you're psychologically developing, when your brain is changing from abstract to abstract thought, from concrete thought, it's hard, and everything is very tentative.
I remember going through puberty and not feeling like it empowered me. I kind of hated it. Like I wasn't ready. I kind of resented it.
Becoming comfortable with your body is one of the tasks of adolescence, and it takes years sometimes. Certainly the younger kids are incredibly awkward. It's so hard for them to see their hands and their feet getting big, their pimples, etc., their voices changing for the boys. For the girls, just developing secondary sexual characteristics can be very disconcerting because often their mind is not where their body is. I think one of the problems with teenagers is that their development is not synchronous necessarily, that their mind and emotions are not necessarily developing at the same time as their body is.
I remember feeling like, especially if you're a girl, feeling like my body was announcing itself before I wanted it to.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Is it these kind of basically sexual puberty differences and developments that make adolescence so challenging, or is there a lot more going on?
It's only a piece of it. The brain is changing, emotions are changing.
How is the brain changing?
Well, when you go from childhood to adolescence, first of all, what happens is your brain gets bigger, and then it gets smaller. Things get pruned. So there's this concept where use it or lose it. You have lots of different connections, and unless you nurture those particular connections, they dissipate.
At what age?
All through adolescence and through all the way into the mid-20s. In addition to that, I think what happens is there's certain parts of the brain that develop quicker, and those are the parts that have to do with reward and risk, reward, and also emotions. That's the amygdala and the ventral striatum. And those parts develop much more quickly than the frontal cortex, which has more to do with rational decision making.
Is that when people say executive function?
Exactly, exactly.
Do you think that that some of these huge changes that happen in adolescence are what draws teenagers to, comic heroes and larger than life tales, because what's happening to teenagers in those stories kind of mythologizes what's happening to them?
Absolutely. They need to have a vision of possibilities in order to actually step out of their house sometimes.
There was a movie last year called Middle School, the Worst Years of My Life, and it had this little girl who just could not wait to be older, but
Yes.
she had to.
Yeah.
And in Homecoming, Spiderman literally cannot wait to fight with the big guys, but he's not a big guy either. Adolescents are almost there, but there are parts of them that are not yet adult. What parts are those?
Clearly, physically, some kids are not adult, but their brain is not adult either. I think one of my favorite lines in Spider-Man is, "Why is everyone treating me like a kid?" And someone says, "Because you are a kid." There's this need to sort of be treated with respect and to sort of demonstrate your own autonomy, but at the same time, you have limits of society, you have limits of your own body and of your own mind. So there's conflict sometimes.
And every child matures at a different rate. So you take some 14-year-olds and some look like mini adults and some look like tweens, right?
Absolutely.
That must be very confusing for children of similar ages to figure out how to relate to each other.
Actually, I think we have good data to show that early developers are perhaps more at risk than later developers. You would think the opposite, but in reality, kids whose bodies develop faster than their emotions and their ability to negotiate relationships, they have a harder time and often engage in riskier behaviors.
And does that happen to girls more than boys?
Yes, but it happens to both.
Why? Because it's happening more and more, isn't it? Aren't they saying that the onset of puberty is happening at younger and younger ages?
Well, it's been around the same time for a while, but previously, ages ago, it was definitely older. The kids hit puberty at an older age. I think part of that has to do with nutrition. Believe it or not, as nutrition became better and people's bodies matured faster and sexual secondary characteristics came out earlier.
Do the teenagers you treat reference teenagers whom they see in popular culture?
Yeah, in the last 5 years, 10 years, most of the teenagers, many of the teenagers who I interview want to be, guess what they want to be? I'll ask you, tell me, what do you think they want to be when they grow up?
Oh no, is it someone on is it a reality show?
Nope.
Oh.
Nope.
And it's not a professional athlete?
The younger adolescent boys want to be professional athletes. Let's move them out.
But what do they want to be, vampires and werewolves?
No.
That's tough to achieve.
They want to be forensic.
Right.
Forensic psychologists, work for the BAU, part of the FBI.
Oftentimes, actors playing teenagers are long past the zits and awkward phase. Rachel McAdams was 26 in Mean Girls. On Glee, the late Corey Monteith was 28. Cole Sprouse in the upcoming Riverdale series on the CW is 24, but still playing a high school sophomore. If these actors still look like teenagers into their 20s, are they still teenagers?
Well, adolescence has sort of expanded its age group. So now pretty much a lot of young adults in their 20s are adolescents for lots of reasons.
What reasons? Scientific reasons or cultural
Well,
reasons?
their brain, as we know, still develops into their 20s. So we know that they're still pruning and they're still basically having their executive function sort of take over a little bit more. Okay, so that's one piece of it. But also, if you look at the tasks of adolescents, can they achieve financial independence? Okay? How long does it take? Now with education going way into the 20s, it takes kids a longer time to sort of establish a vocational identity, learn how to support themselves, develop intimacy, figure out who they are as a human being, have relationships that actually work, renegotiate where they are with their parents. I mean, separation is a big part of adolescence, but the end of it is a renegotiation of where you're going to be with your family.
But as I'm hearing you describe this, I'm thinking, my mom got married when she was barely 21 and started families. And my parents and the generations before them, they were getting married at 18, 19.
Right.
You can tell me differently, but I don't think our brains have changed the way we just anatomically and neurologically go through adolescence. So what does it mean that almost for all of history,
society has changed, expectations have changed.
but
And
we were
again,
all being raised by teenagers in a way.
We were
right?
indeed.
People with very little
We
executive
were
function.
indeed.
I mean, what does that mean what does it mean for, say,
maybe that's why we were less helicoptered.
because they needed to sort out their own
Their
stuff?
own stuff.
That's so interesting.
Yeah.
Is there scientifically speaking, is there sort of a rigid boundary for when adolescence ends? I mean, we like to think, 19 is the end of being a teenager. Do you wake up on your 20th birthday and say, I'm a grown-up now?
No, adolescence goes on for quite a long time depending on your context, depending on how self-sufficient you are, depending on where you are educationally, depending on, are you going to be a doctor? Well, if you're going to be a doctor, it's going to take into your late 20s, basically, before you begin to feel like an adult. You're in school for an awful long time.
What would you call those kids in their third year of medical school an adolescent?
In a lot of ways, yes.
Why?
Because they're still figuring things out. They don't have a vocational identity. They know they want to be a doctor, but what kind of doctor? In what kind of practice? What are their interactions with patients going to be? They're still learning. Often they don't have steady relationships yet because there's no time to actually develop them. They are certainly not financially independent at that time. So yeah, they're adolescents.
We hear a lot about the effect of hyper-perfection of the movies and how it affects girls, but even in our friendly neighborhood Spiderman, who is supposed to be a nerd, he has magnificent abs and biceps.
He does indeed.
Yeah, I mean, short of being bitten by a radioactive spider, is the adolescent body capable of sort of building that kind of,
Muscle
super
mass?
musculature? Yeah.
Early adolescence, no, you're not capable of that. As you get older into your, basically between the ages of 17 and 21, you can start getting there.
Culturally, is childhood lasting longer?
I think it's funny. I think childhood is getting shorter and adolescence is getting longer. So I think I've started to see kids dealing with adolescent issues pretty much around the age of 10. And
What would you
then
name an adolescent issue? Like what?
certainly body image, relationships, cliques, all the kind of stuff that young adolescents go through, the kids are going through earlier and earlier. School pressure, all that kind of stuff. I always think of childhood as a time when school pressure is not really there. It starts to sort of kick in as you try to find where you're going. And we're seeing that earlier and earlier, 9 and 10. And then at the same time, like I said, I think teenagers aren't getting their heads together that easily, and that young people into their 20s are still struggling.
So you're saying
Adolescence is basically from 10 to 30. Yeah, that's what I think.
you're saying that childhood seems to be getting shorter, but kids' bodies are not staying childlike for a commensurate amount of time, right?
There's an asynchrony. There's a conflict between what your body's doing and what your emotions and your mind are doing.
And you know, something that you haven't brought up yet, and I'm surprised because I can't imagine adolescence without it, is social media. I mean, how has that changed what it means to be a teenager today?
I think social media has changed what it means to be a human being today. You know, adults also are going through the same thing. But yes, you are now not just visible to those who see you in your classroom, in your family, you are now visible to the world. And that excessive visibility, I think, takes a toll, particularly for kids who are struggling with self-esteem and self-image problems.
Because you can incessantly compare yourself to other people. There's that quotation, I think it was Teddy Roosevelt said, comparison is the thief of joy.
That's true.
And you must see patients all the time who, I mean, all they have to do is look at their phones to see what.
It's so much easier now to feel inadequate.
Yeah, you can feel it all the time and immediately.
Exactly.
Okay, so how do you know when your kid has become an adult?
I guess when they make more money than you.
In your case, do you have any kids who have become adults yet?
Indeed.
Oh, congratulations.
Yes.
No, I mean,
No.
economic solvency is certainly a life
that's a
marker,
piece
but
of it.
what else?
Ideally, when they've established a relationship, intimacy, have the ability to achieve intimacy with another person. I think that's a really important part of adolescence.
A person who's not their parent.
Right. Learning how to basically walk around the world independently, but come back to the parent and have a renegotiated relationship with less conflict, perhaps. I think that's also a good piece of adulthood when adolescent becomes an adult.
That's a good description, because it is life-changing when you recognize that your parents may not be right about stuff. They may not be all wrong either, but they're flawed, and you can still love them. And some people never achieve that, right?
And you can choose what the pieces of your parents that you want for yourself. You don't reject everything, but at the same time, you don't completely become a new person. You often have decided what you want from your upbringing to keep as your person.
In this year's crop of adolescent dramas, there are, as always, lots of remakes and reboots. Riverdale is a modern take on the old Archie comics, except in our 2016 version of Riverdale, Archie Andrews is sleeping with his teacher, and Betty Cooper is popping her mom's prescriptions. And in the first episode, Archie and Jughead witness a murder. So
yeah, the old Archie comics were not like this at all. I was
not your
brought
mom's
up on
Archie
them.
comics.
Yes, I was totally brought up on them, and this is quite different. I think this portrays adolescent as a moody kind of sexual time, which I think is also a good part of adolescence. It's there, this kind of sultry atmosphere where relationships are negotiated and renegotiated all the time, where you're developing an identity, where sexual identity, sexual orientation is being explored. All these things are, again, part of adolescence, and they're being explored in this comic series.
in the time you've been treating teenage patients, have you seen changes in how early sort of sexuality and well, not just sexuality, but sexual exploration takes place? I mean, are kids having sex earlier than they used to, or around about the same age?
Some are, some aren't. I mean, I think it's wrong to make complete generalizations. We know that by 19, almost 3/4 of adolescents have had sexual relationships of some kind or another. We do worry about the kids who do it too early, because often they don't really understand what they're getting into, and generally they tend to not have relationships that are nurturing when they have sexual experiences way too early.
Because of what you do, are you often the first, one of the first, or the only people who knows
Yes.
what your patients are up
Yes,
to?
yes.
What is that like, and what's the legality of knowing that a minor, child is doing something, you may want to tell the
It
parents.
yes, it all depends on state law. In New York, adolescents have the right to get confidential care for reproductive health. So that includes contraception, testing and treating for sexually transmitted infections. That includes pregnancy testing. We also allow adolescents to access mental health care without parental consent, and also to access care for substance use as well.
Wow. That I am imagining that must feel like conflicting to you, right? Because if you find out that you have a patient who is either sexually active or addicted to something or has a mental health issue, one would want to enlist the family to help, right?
So again, the caveat is if the child is a danger to self or others, if you really feel that this child is in trouble and that you need to break confidentiality, you should do it. My take on this is I always tell the child, I tell the teenager, because I am worried about your safety, I feel like we have to break confidentiality. I tell them this in advance, actually, before they even disclose anything, but I will do it. I will tell you first, and we'll discuss how to do this to get you the help you need.
As a culture, we've kind of come to this agreement that childhood should be protected. Should adolescence, or is risk-taking a really big part of learning to grow up?
Well, you know, one of the reasons that the brain basically develops asynchronously so that your risk center is more active than your executive functioning center is because risk is necessary. It's an evolutionary necessity. If you were not able as an adolescent to take risks, you would never leave the nest. And creativity is all about risk. So risk is actually very, very important. And what we want is obviously kids to step out of their safe environment and take risks. We do want that. We want them to take risks in school, with people, with everything. We just want them to be safe.
Yeah. It sort of begs the question about what we call helicopter parenting today. Is that something that you've seen grow more and more as you've practiced?
In certain communities, yes, and in certain communities, no.
I mean, the reason I bring that up is it's sort of part and parcel of helicopter parenting is taking away the risks that your child might experience.
Right. Yes, and that
It's a
that
disservice,
can be
you're
hard.
saying.
It's a disservice. I think kids really do have to step outside the boundaries and figure things out for themselves, and it's very scary. You can't protect them from everything.
Are you basically the most unflappable person? Like, you have teenagers who, does your jaw ever drop? I mean, do they ever tell you something that you're like, what?
Yep. But I like to learn. So when my jaw drops, I say, tell me more. That's really interesting. That's something I really had never thought of. Tell me more about it. I love learning about these kids.
And what is it that draws you to devote your professional life to teenagers?
They are never boring. I love being stimulated intellectually. And I like listening, and I like helping and guiding, but the big thing is they are never boring. I do not want to be in a boring job.
And you say you like listening. I mean, if you had to give someone your number one tip for how to deal with the teenager, I mean, deal sounds pejorative, right? But how to connect with the teenager, is it listening?
It's listening. It's true listening. And it's also accepting. It's hard for parents sometimes to accept things they don't want to accept. It's really hard.
Like what?
A child's limitations, a child's direction, a child's identity, whatever it's going to be, parents struggle sometimes. And being accepting and also listening, I think, are really, really critical.
In Treasure Island, the 1883 novel by Robert Louis Stevenson, the kid hero, Jim Hawkins, is a real kid. He has no superpowers and is always at the mercy of the morally ambiguous Long John Silver. But in most modern movies, children and teens have extraordinary skills. In Harry Potter, kids can bend the laws of physics. In the Hunger Games, they change the course of a nation. Is that a lot of pressure for a teenager?
Slightly, yep. And again, it caters to their fantasy life, to this need to be a hero, to be a rebel, to step outside their box and do something special. So is it a pressure? I think not so much pressure. It's nice to have that fantasy life because it helps kids sort of just get themselves out of their immediate environment and sort of think of possibilities.
If you wanted to write a movie that starred a teenager, what would you want him or her to experience as the protagonist?
I love fantasy life. I love heroism, rebellion. I love this, the kind of sultry sexuality thing that's so, that's very seductive. I love the whole piece of it.
You embrace the sultry sexuality of adolescence.
It's part of it. It's
yeah,
totally
I guess parents don't want to think it's there,
it's there. It's there.
It's there, and it must not be denied, right? Because
no, I think if we deny it, the kids are going to do it anyway, and we're just in the dark.
Do a lot of your patients read YA, young adult literature?
Not very much. I think some of the younger teens will read some of the books geared for early adolescence, but as a rule, I find that kids read less, and they tend to watch more.
They watch more.
Yep.
So
it's a different world.
Movies and TVs, movies and screen time is very important, the stories that they're seeing.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much. That's all we have time for today.
Thank you very much.
Whatever we can't fit into this half hour, we'll share on our Science Goes to the Movies Facebook page. And if you want to watch past episodes, check us out at www.cuny.tv under the Science tab. Or download our app to keep up with everything related to Science Goes to the Movies all in one place.